returned. Witnesses later said he collapsed near Stabiae, suffocated by toxic fumes. A man of science consumed by the very curiosity that made him great. The survivors who managed to escape the region stumbled through an unrecognizable landscape. Vineyards were gone. Rivers had changed course. Entire towns had vanished beneath layers of ash so thick that even roads disappeared. Farmers searching for their homes found only hills of grey where villages once stood. The mountain loomed above them still, its peak torn open and steaming, like a wound that would never heal. For days, the ash continued to fall, smothering everything within miles. The few who returned to dig through the ruins found only silence, the faint outline of doorways, the occasional charred beam, the ghostly impressions of the dead. They whispered that the gods had buried Pompeii for its sins, that Venus herself had turned away from the city that had worshipped her in name, but not in virtue. As weeks passed, nature began its quiet reclaiming. Grass sprouted through cracks in the ash. Birds returned cautiously. The memory of the eruption began to fade into rumour. A warning turned into myth. The empire moved on. Rome itself barely noticed. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum slipped beneath history's surface, sealed in their ashen tombs, and for almost 17 centuries they slept, waiting for the day when their story would rise again from the dust. Centuries passed. Grass grew over the buried towns, and the memory of Pompeii faded into legend. Farmers ploughed fields over the ash, unaware that beneath their feet lay entire streets, frozen in the moment of death. The mountain, now quiet and deceptively calm again, became part of the landscape once more. Travellers passing through Campania saw only fertile soil and olive groves, never imagining the vast necropolis sleeping below. By the Middle Ages, the name Pompeii had vanished from maps. The Romans who survived the disaster had long since died, and their descendants no longer knew where the city had stood. Some believed it had been swallowed by the sea. Others whispered that the gods had buried it on purpose, as punishment for arrogance. And so the mountain was left alone, its story buried as deeply as its victims. Then, in 1599, a canal digger unearthed something strange. Frescoed walls, bones, and strange inscriptions beneath the volcanic earth. But the discovery frightened more than it fascinated. The workers sealed the site again, fearing the wrath of the gods. It would take another century for curiosity to triumph over superstition. In 1748, under the reign of Charles III of Bourbon, systematic excavations began. What they uncovered stunned the world. Entire villas emerged, their paintings still vibrant, their mosaics intact. Bronze statues stood in courtyards, undisturbed since that final day of 79 CE. Bread still sat in ovens, carbonized but perfectly shaped. Dogs still lay chained to doorposts, and bodies, hundreds of them, appeared in lifelike poses, the expressions on their faces frozen in that last breath. Archaeologists poured plaster into the hollow spaces left by decayed flesh, revealing hauntingly human figures. A mother shielding her child, a man covering his mouth, a couple locked in a final embrace. Pompeii was reborn, not as a city of the living, but as a ghost preserved in stone. The rediscovery of Pompeii offered something no text or scroll ever could. A direct glimpse into Roman life, its beauty, its excess, and its fragility. The city that once died in silence began to speak again, whispering its warnings through cracked walls and ash-stained frescoes, that nature never forgets, and time, no matter how long, always uncovers the truth. Pompeii's rediscovery didn't just reveal ruins, it revealed people. Every fresco, mosaic, and plaster cast spoke in the language of tragedy and beauty. Scholars and artists who walked those silent streets in the 18th and 19th centuries described the experience as visiting a city caught between life and death. The echoes of laughter, footsteps, and market cries seemed to linger in the air, preserved under centuries of silence. Walls still bore the graffiti of everyday Romans, love notes, insults, and political slogans, all untouched by time. One inscription read, Gaius Pomidius Diphilus was here, scratched into plaster nearly 2 millennia earlier. Others were more humorous. If anyone sits here, let him read this before he dies. Drink wine, be merry. The wit of a people long dead survived their bodies. Pompeii was no longer just an archaeological site. It was a diary written by the doomed. But as more of the city was uncovered, fascination began to mingle with discomfort. The plaster figures, locked forever in the moment of death, were too human. Mothers, slaves, children, and lovers, their expressions clear and heartbreaking. Visitors came to stare. Some moved to tears, others morbidly curious. Museums filled with relics, silver cups, jewellery, even carbonized loaves of bread, each one a silent testament to ordinary lives abruptly halted. By the late 19th century, Pompeii had become a symbol of impermanence, a warning carved in ash. Writers and poets came to walk its streets, Dickens, Goethe, Twain. They found in the ruins both horror and intimacy, a civilization that had everything and lost it in a single day. Artists painted it as a romantic tragedy. Scientists studied it as a geological marvel. Yet, beneath every interpretation, the same unease lingered, that what happened once could happen again, and indeed, it could. Vesuvius still smoked quietly on the horizon, its slopes now dotted with villages. Locals farmed the same soil that had buried their ancestors. Tourists admired the view, without thinking too long about what slept below. The mountain, patient and silent, waited. For in the ruins of Pompeii, one truth endured, that human brilliance and fragility are forever entwined, and that beneath beauty, the earth remembers everything. Today, Mount Vesuvius stands quiet, deceptively so. Its slopes are green again, lined with vineyards that produce the same wine once poured in Pompeian taverns. Tourists hike to its rim, peer into the crater, and snap photos where gods once breathed fire. To the casual eye, it seems peaceful, a sleeping giant that has long since surrendered its rage. But beneath that serene facade lies a cauldron still alive, simmering in silence. Scientists know this. The magma chamber hasn't cooled. It waits. At its feet, modern Naples bustles, a city of millions living in the shadow of ancient death. Children play soccer on the same plains where ash once fell like snow. Farmers plough fields that hide the bones of emperors' subjects. Each year, tremors ripple through the region, reminders that the earth is not as stable as it looks. Locals shrug them off, just as the Romans did in 79 CE. Human memory is short, and the mountain is patient. Volcanologists monitor it constantly. Sensors buried deep record its every pulse, its every whisper. Maps outline evacuation zones. Plans are drawn and redrawn. But even experts admit, if Vesuvius were to erupt again, there would be chaos. The population around it is far greater now than in Roman times. The fertile land that once sustained an empire still tempts those who choose to live close enough to lose everything again. And yet, Vesuvius remains strangely magnetic. Pilgrims of history and curiosity climb its slopes to gaze upon the plains where two cities vanished. From above, they can still trace Pompeii's outline. Streets, walls, amphitheatres, a fossilized heartbeat of Rome's golden age. The silence there feels heavy, almost reverent. The city may be gone, but its story pulses stronger than ever. The eruption of 79 CE was more than a tragedy. It was a mirror. It showed that civilizations, however powerful, exist on borrowed time. That beauty, art, and order can vanish in an instant. Vesuvius sleeps now, its breath hidden beneath centuries of calm. But its shadow stretches through time, reminding us that beneath every moment of peace, the world's fire still burns, unseen, waiting, eternal. Long before the crowds screamed his name, Scorpus was nothing. a slave boy born into dust and danger. He wasn't born in Rome, but likely in Hispania, a far province where fate had cruel hands. Captured or sold into servitude, he was trained young for the violent ballet of the Circus Maximus, the arena where horses, wheels and men blurred into thunder. There, boys like him were moulded into racers, their childhood traded for speed. The life of a charioteer was no child's game. Training began before sunrise. Scorpus learned to control 4 horses, the quadriga, while balancing on a wooden platform no wider than a door. One slip, and you'd be dragged to death, your body crushed beneath the hooves. The instructors were ruthless. The arena did not forgive mistakes, and neither did Rome. He was property, a tool for entertainment. But in the empire, even a slave could chase glory. Charioteers who survived long enough could earn their freedom and unimaginable wealth. The factions that ruled the circus, the reds, blues, greens and whites, were more than sporting teams. They were empires of their own, each with patrons, political influence, and fanatic supporters who painted city walls with slogans of devotion. Scorpus began in the stables of one of these factions, shoveling manure, grooming horses, and watching races from the shadows. But the boy had something others didn't: precision, nerve, and a terrifying calm under chaos. He could read a horse's breathing, predict a rival's mistake, and turn the chariot's reins like an artist flicking a brush. When he finally entered his first race, the crowd hardly noticed him, a nameless slave among legends. But when the gates opened and the horses exploded into motion, Scorpus handled his reins with impossible grace. He took the inside curve so tight that even veterans flinched. Dust rose, wheels screamed, and by the final lap, his name was on every tongue. He crossed the finish line not as a slave, but as a promise, a new star in the making. The crowd roared his name, and for the first time, Scorpus looked up at the imperial box and thought, maybe the gods have noticed me after all. The Circus Maximus, Rome's heartbeat, its madness, its addiction. It could hold 250,000 people, each one shouting, betting, praying for victory. To the crowd, chariot racing wasn't sport. It was religion. They wore their faction's colours like war paint, the blues, greens, reds, and whites. Men died for these colours. Riots broke out over them. Senators and slaves sat side by side, their eyes locked on the dust storm that was the track. For Scorpus, the circus was both a stage and a battlefield. Every race began with the same ritual: the creak of the starting gates, the blare of trumpets, the pounding of hooves. 7 laps, 1,200 metres each, and every inch could kill you. The trick wasn't just speed, it was nerve. The corners, the mete, were killers. Too wide, and you'd lose time. Too tight, and you'd crash, dragging your team and rivals into a tangle of reins and blood. Scorpus mastered those corners like few before him. He became known for his precision, the way his chariot seemed to brush death without fear. Crowds gasped when he cut the turn so close the wheel nearly kissed the post. His control was supernatural. Even veteran drivers stared in disbelief. To the people, Scorpus wasn't just a racer. He was possessed by the gods of speed themselves. As victories piled up, so did the fame. His name appeared on graffiti across Rome. Scorpus, the pride of the Greens. Victory to Scorpus? Children carved it into walls. Vendors sold small clay figures of him and his horses. Fans chanted his name in taverns and argued about him in the baths. He was everywhere, the Empire's first true celebrity athlete. But with fame came pressure. The factions were ruthless. If you lost, they replaced you. If you won, they worked you to exhaustion. Every race carried the risk of death: a snapped axle, a broken rein, a fall beneath the hooves. Scorpus knew it. He had seen too many friends dragged into the dirt. Yet he kept racing, kept winning, as if he were outrunning fate itself. The crowd adored him, and the gods, as always, were watching. To understand Scorpus, You had to understand his world. A city divided not by politics or class, but by colours. The factions ruled Rome's passions. The Greens and the Blues were the giants, their rivalries so fierce that they often spilled from the circus into the streets. Supporters brawled in taverns, sabotaged stables, and even bribed officials to fix races. The Reds and Whites lingered as lesser powers, but their fans were just as devoted. Scorpus rode for the Greens, the faction of speed, style, and ruthless ambition. Their stables were filled with the Empire's best horses, imported from Numidia and Hispania, animals worth more than villas. To win for the Greens meant wealth, women, and immortality. To lose meant ridicule, or worse. The pressure was relentless. The circus was a theatre of extremes. Each faction had spies, mechanics, and even magicians who claimed to bless the reins. Drivers were celebrities and targets. Sabotage wasn't uncommon. Reins cut, wheels tampered with, horses drugged. When Scorpus appeared at the gates, his fans erupted, waving green scarves and shouting his name like a war cry. He was their champion, their weapon against the Blues, and the Blues had theirs. Pompeius Musclosus, a veteran racer known for his cunning and brutality. Their duels became the talk of Rome. One race in particular became legend. The two men were neck and neck on the final lap, their chariots so close that the horses' manes brushed. Musclosus tried to cut Scorpus off at the turn, a deadly move, but Scorpus anticipated it. With a flick of his wrist, he pulled tighter to the post, scraping so close the crowd gasped. The Blues' chariot shattered against the barrier. Scorpus flew ahead to victory, his tunic and face streaked with blood and dust. The stands exploded. People threw garlands and coins into the track. The emperor himself rose to applaud. Rome had found its hero. But even as Scorpus basked in glory, he knew what that meant. Greater fame, greater envy, and greater danger. Because in the Circus Maximus, the crowd loved you only as long as you kept winning. And Scorpus, for all his brilliance, was racing toward a finish line no man could ever escape. By the time Scorpus reached his 20s, he was untouchable. Rome's fastest man, the darling of the green faction, and the face that sold every charm, amulet, and wine cup bearing his likeness. He had become what Rome had never truly seen before, a sports celebrity. Yet beneath the cheers and gilded rewards, his life remained chained to the same track that had first enslaved him. Each race was another roll of the dice with death. Charioteers tied the reins around their waists for better control, meaning a crash could drag them like ragdolls until they were pulped beneath the hooves. Scorpus had seen it happen countless times. The arena crews carried hooks specifically to drag the dead and dying off the course. Efficient, brutal, routine. Every morning he looked at those hooks and wondered how long before they would be for him. But still, he raced. The more he won, the more the people demanded. Merchants sold tiny lead tokens stamped with his face, used for bets or as lucky charms. Children scratched his name into the walls. Scorpus brings victory. Wealthy patrons threw fortunes at him for sponsorships. He was a freedman now, but freedom in Rome was a performance. To stay adored, he had to keep winning. He pushed harder, racing more than anyone else, sometimes several times a day. His rivals began to fear him, but fear turned to hatred. Rumours spread that his horses were bewitched, that he bribed priests, that the Greens fed him drugs for strength. In truth, he was simply obsessed. Winning was no longer about gold or fame. It was about proving that a slave could rise above the empire that had once owned him. The wear began to show. His body ached, his reflexes dulled, but he refused to slow down. "Scorpus cannot lose," fans shouted, and he believed them. Each morning, as he stood in the chariot yard lacing the reins, he stared at the mountain of wreaths, trophies, and gold plates that lined his chamber, proof of his immortality. Yet somewhere deep inside, he knew what every charioteer knew but never said aloud. The circus didn't crown heroes. It devoured them. And Rome was always hungry for another fall. To understand Scorpus, you had to understand his horses. They were his partners, his weapons, his salvation. He drove a quadriga, 4 horses abreast, names whispered across the empire like legends. Sella, Swift, Volusa, Flying One, Cottinus, and Sparsus. Each was trained for balance and precision, chosen not just for speed but for temperament. The slightest panic in one could mean death for all. Every morning, Scorpus visited their stables before dawn. He spoke to them softly, running his hands over their manes, checking the straps himself. He knew their moods, their snorts, their rhythm. He didn't treat them as beasts, but as comrades. The bond between charioteer and horse was sacred, one built on trust, forged in terror. In a race, the horses had to respond to the flick of his wrist, the pressure of a rein, or even a shouted word in the chaos of thunderous hooves. The Greens spared no expense in training. The horses were bathed in olive oil, fed mixtures of barley and honey, and massaged after every run. Rome adored them almost as much as the drivers. Children could name them, poets praised them. But to Scorpus, they were more than fame. They were family, the only beings who knew what it was like to fly on the edge of death. During races, Scorpus spoke to his team like a general commanding soldiers. He guided the leftmost horse, the Funalis Sinister, with a mix of tenderness and authority, keeping the team tight on the inner curve. It was a delicate balance of brutality and grace. When they moved, they became one, a living storm of muscle, dust, and willpower. There were moments, fleeting but unforgettable, when Scorpus felt weightless. The crowd disappeared, the dust parted, and he could feel the pulse of the horses as if it were his own heartbeat. Those moments were his reward, the illusion of control over chaos, of mastery over fate. Yet every time the gates opened, the gods rolled their dice again. One stumble, one cracked wheel, one frightened horse, and the fastest man in Rome could become another corpse on the sand. But Scorpus had never been one for safety. He was born in the dust, and he intended to die in the wind. As Scorpus' victories multiplied, so did his fortune. By his mid-20s, he was richer than most senators. The prize money from over 2,000 wins was staggering, each victory worth bags of gold, jewels, or even villas. He had gone from slave to superstar, from obscurity to a man cheered by emperors. Rome had never seen anything like him. He bought his freedom early, but the arena wouldn't let him go. The Greens offered him a luxurious estate, chariots crafted by the best artisans, and servants to tend to his every whim. His likeness appeared on oil lamps, mosaics, and drinking cups. Graffiti praising him covered tavern walls. Victory to Scorpus. He drives like the wind. Even noblewomen whispered his name behind silk fans. Rome's most desirable bachelor was also its most dangerous man. The Emperor Domitian himself invited Scorpus to imperial banquets, seating him near senators who once wouldn't have let him clean their sandals. But the fame had edges sharper than a chariot's blade. To some, he was a hero. To others, a reminder that Rome's hierarchy was fragile. A former slave, richer than patricians, adored by the mob, it was both intoxicating and threatening. Despite the wealth and flattery, Scorpus lived simply. His heart belonged to the track. He spent his days training horses, perfecting turns, studying his rivals' weaknesses. When asked why he kept racing, he supposedly replied, "The crowd doesn't cheer for rest." To disappoint Rome was unthinkable. The city demanded spectacle, and he was its favourite offering. But even the crowd's love grew greedy. They expected miracles every race. When he won, they roared his name as if he were divine. When he stumbled, they booed with the same ferocity. Scorpus understood the fickleness of fame. It was like his horses, powerful, beautiful, and easily lost. Still, when he rode, everything else vanished. The politics, the expectations, the danger, gone. Only the wind, the thunder of hooves, and the taste of dust remained. For those few minutes in the Circus Maximus, Scorpus wasn't a freedman or a pawn of the Greens. He was Rome itself, wild, glorious, and doomed to burn out faster than anyone could imagine. The crowds saw only triumph, never the toll. Every race that Scorpus won carved a little more life out of him. The body of a charioteer aged faster than a soldier's. His hands were a map of scars, his knees shattered from years of standing on a wooden plank as the chariot jolted and slammed through turns. His back ached constantly. His lungs burned from breathing dust and ash, and his eyes squinted against the blinding sun and grit of the track. He was barely 26, and already an old man by the standards of his trade. Few charioteers lived past 30. The circus had its heroes, but it buried them young. Their names were carved into tombs, not triumphal arches. Every driver knew it. Scorpus knew it best. Yet every dawn he strapped the reins around his waist again and stepped into the same chariot that might kill him. Some said he was addicted to the speed. Others whispered that he was cursed, that no man could win that often without the gods demanding payment. Rome loved him, but the city's love was cruel. The same crowds that cheered him would cheer his death. Should it come spectacularly enough, there were omens too. A chariot wheel that cracked before a race, the sudden death of one of his favourite horses, strange dreams that left him shaken. His friends begged him to slow down, to retire while still whole. He smiled and waved them off. "The race ends when the sand drinks the blood," he joked, the kind of joke only a man who's tasted death could make. Still, the unease grew. His rivals muttered that he'd tempted fate too long. Priests warned that Fortuna's wheel turned fastest for those at the top, but Scorpus couldn't stop. For him, life outside the circus wasn't life at all. The roar of the crowd, the trembling ground, the moment when the horses broke free from the gates, that was his existence. And somewhere deep down, he must have known that his next victory could be his last. Rome didn't build legends to last forever. It built them to burn brilliantly, and then vanish in the dust. It was a cold morning in the winter of 95 CE when Scorpus climbed into his chariot for what would become his final race. The sky above the Circus Maximus was a flat, grey sheet, the kind of light that dulled the shine of the armour and made the dust look like ash. The crowd didn't care. They filled the stands as they always did, roaring for the greens, the blues, the reds, the whites. But when Scorpus appeared at the starting gates, even the noise shifted. Rome knew greatness when it saw it. The horses, Sella, Volusa, Catinus, and Sparsus, stamped and snorted, sensing the tension. Scorpus leaned forward, murmuring to them, as he always did, steadying their breath and his own. He had done this thousands of times, but that morning something in him felt distant, as though he were watching himself from outside his body. Perhaps it was fatigue. Perhaps it was fate. The horn sounded. The gates flew open. 12 chariots burst forward like a storm unchained. Dust exploded into the air. The roar of the crowd became a single, endless wave. Scorpus took the inner track, his signature move, cutting so tight the wheels grazed the turning post. He was in second place by the 4th lap, his green tunic streaked with sweat and grime. Then it happened. On the 6th lap, as he rounded the bend, one of his horses stumbled. The left rein snapped. A rare, almost impossible accident. In that instant, the perfect harmony between man and beast shattered. The chariot lurched, spun, and tipped. The wheel struck the barrier, splintering like bone. The reins tied around his waist dragged him beneath his own team. The crowd gasped, a sound louder than thunder, then silence. By the time the dust settled, Scorpus lay motionless in the sand, his body mangled by the very power that had made him immortal. The Greens stopped cheering. Even the Blues lowered their banners. Rome had seen thousands of deaths in its arenas, but this one struck deeper, because for the first time, the greatest racer in history had lost a race not to another man, but to destiny itself. When the race was over, the crowd did not cheer. A silence heavier than stone hung over the Circus Maximus. The emperor's attendants covered their faces. Even the bookkeepers, who recorded every lap and every wager, stopped writing. Scorpus was gone. He had died instantly. His spine snapped, his body broken beneath the hooves of his own horses. But in Rome, death was not the end. It was the beginning of legend. Within hours, word spread through the city. From the Subura to the Palatine Hill, people whispered, "Scorpus is dead." Tavern patrons slammed their cups down in disbelief. Boys who had dreamed of driving for the Greens wept in the streets. The graffiti artists who had once written "Victory to Scorpus" now scrawled new words. Rome mourns her champion. The Greens held his funeral with imperial honours. His body was carried through the streets draped in emerald cloth, his helmet shining in the sunlight one last time. Musicians played dirges while the crowd threw flowers and laurel wreaths along the path. The emperor himself ordered a monument built, a marble relief showing Scorpus holding the palm of victory, forever frozen in triumph. His epitaph, found centuries later, read, "I am Scorpus, carried off by the envy of swift fate at the age of 26, after winning 2,000 victories." Even in death, the record stood unmatched. He had lived faster and brighter than anyone of his age, and Rome never forgot. In time, his story became a symbol of glory, of mortality, of Rome's insatiable hunger for spectacle. Later racers invoked his name before entering the arena, praying for even a fragment of his luck and his courage. The poets compared him to Achilles, doomed to greatness that could not last. And though centuries passed, the dust of the Circus Maximus still holds his ghost. Archaeologists have found carvings of his name on walls, tiny tokens stamped with his likeness, and the faint traces of hoofprints in the hardened sand. Each fragment whispers the same truth. Scorpus may have died young, but he never truly stopped racing. His wheels still turn in Rome's memory, forever chasing the finish line where mortals become immortal. In ancient Greece, the gymnasium was not just a place for exercise. It was a sanctuary where body and spirit met the divine. Every major city-state had one. A sprawling complex of colonnades, training yards, and shaded courtyards lined with olive trees. Young men came not only to build strength, but to cultivate arete, that perfect harmony of body, mind, and virtue the Greeks saw as the highest human calling. The word gymnasium itself came from gymnos. Naked to train, nude was not scandalous, but sacred. The Greeks believed the human form was a reflection of the gods, every muscle, every sinew, a testament to divine craftsmanship. The gymnasium was a stage for that perfection, a place where mortals could strive to reach the balance and beauty of Olympus. At dawn, the athletes arrived carrying small jars of olive oil. The air was cool, still heavy with the scent of dew and laurel leaves. Before the first exercises began, each man cleansed himself in the baths, washing away the dust of the city and the impurities of the night. Then came silence. The Pedar tribes, the trainer, raised his hands toward the sky and led a prayer to Zeus, Hermes, and Heracles, gods of competition, speed, and strength. Sometimes a small offering was placed at a nearby altar, a few drops of oil, a laurel branch, or a libation of wine. The young athletes stood still, their oiled skin glistening under the morning sun. This was not mere vanity. It was ritual. The oil symbolized vitality, the divine fire within. It protected the body and honored the gods who granted strength. Once anointed, they dusted themselves with fine sand from the training yard, to give grip, but also to connect flesh with earth, mortal with eternal. When the prayers were done, the courtyard came alive. The crack of discus, the thud of javelins, the rhythmic shouts of men wrestling on the ground. Yet beneath the sweat and exertion, everything was bound by reverence. The gymnasium was not only where champions were made, it was where citizens learned to worship through motion. To sweat in Greece was to pray. Before a single muscle flexed, before a single discus flew, the Greek athlete began his ritual with oil, Olive oil, the lifeblood of Greece, was sacred. It came from the groves of Athena herself, pressed in bronze vats, stored in small alabaster flasks called ariballoi. To anoint the body with oil was not mere preparation, it was devotion. The act transformed the athlete from an ordinary man into something almost divine. In the soft morning light, the men gathered in the apoditerion, the undressing room. There, they stripped bare, leaving behind their cloaks, sandals, and all marks of status. Nobles and commoners stood side by side, equal under the gaze of the gods. Slaves held out the oil, and the athletes rubbed it across their skin. Slow, deliberate strokes that gleamed under the rising sun. The fragrance filled the air, sharp, green, and clean, mixed with the faint metallic tang of bronze. Oiling the body had practical purposes. It softened the skin, prevented injury, and trapped warmth. But the deeper meaning was spiritual. The olive tree was sacred to Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, and its oil symbolized purity and strength. To oil the body was to invite divine favor, to ask the goddess to dwell within the limbs that would soon test their limits. After anointing came the strigil. Made of bronze or iron, the curved blade was used to scrape away the mixture of oil, sweat, and dust that clung to the skin after training. The scraping made a rasping sound, rhythmic and oddly soothing. The residue, a greyish paste, was collected in jars, sometimes even sold for its supposed healing powers. To the Greeks, even the sweat of athletes carried sacred energy. When their bodies shone like polished marble, the athletes stood ready, their skin glowing, their hearts steady, their minds focused. Every movement from that moment forward was ritual. The oil was not armour, but offering. It was said that a well-oiled body pleased the gods as much as the sight of a well-tuned lyre. In Greece, beauty was holiness, and the glistening bodies of the gymnasium were hymns sung in motion. Once their skin gleamed with oil, the athletes performed the next step in their sacred transformation. They dusted themselves with sand. It was not random dirt from the ground, but fine sieved dust from the palestra, the wrestling yard. Trainers kept piles of it near the edges of the court, gathered from years of sweat and footprints. This was the conies, the sacred dust. It clung to the skin like a second blessing. Practically, the sand prevented athletes from slipping during wrestling or losing grip in combat sports. But its meaning reached far deeper. Oil symbolized divine favor. Dust symbolized mortality. Together they created balance, body and soul, heaven and earth. To coat one's oiled body in sand was to acknowledge that every man, no matter how strong, was still bound to the soil of Gaia. The Greeks saw beauty in this contradiction. Perfection wrapped in impermanence. In the gymnasium, trainers moved among the men, ensuring each athlete was properly anointed and dusted. They praised those who struck the right balance. Not too oily, not too dry. Too much oil, they said, and you slip from victory. Too much dust, and you bury yourself before the fight. It was philosophy made physical. Moderation, the Greek ideal, turned into ritual. Once prepared, the athletes tested their bodies. They flexed and stretched, sand shifting on their skin like gold in sunlight. To the onlookers, philosophers, poets, and spectators, the sight bordered on divine. The human form, sculpted and shining, became the very image of Olympus. In fact, many sculptors later modelled statues of gods after the men of the gymnasium, their poses born from these warm-ups and rituals. Before sparring began, each athlete often reached down, scooping a handful of dust, pressing it to his chest, and whispering a short prayer, sometimes to Zeus, sometimes to Heracles, patron of strength. They believed that in that grainy embrace between flesh and earth, they found divine connection. The gymnasium floor shimmered, not with blood or violence, but with bodies kissed by oil and dust. It was here that the Greeks found holiness not in temples, but in motion itself. in the sacred choreography of mortals striving to resemble gods. Before the first race was run, before the first discus cut the air, every athlete in Greece turned to the gods. The gymnasium was sacred, but competition was divine theatre, a ritual performance offered to Olympus itself. Every contest began not with movement, but with prayer. The athletes gathered before small altars built at the edges of the training grounds, usually dedicated to Zeus, Hermes, or Heracles, gods of strength, speed, and struggle. The air was thick with incense. A priest or elder stepped forward carrying a bowl of grain or wine. Silence fell. Even the chatter of the spectators quieted, for the Greeks believed that the gods watched every match as eagerly as mortals did. The priest raised his hands and spoke words that had echoed across centuries. Grant these men strength without hubris, courage without rage, and victory worthy of the gods. Each athlete then offered his own private prayer. Some knelt, others simply bowed their heads. They might whisper to Hermes for speed, to Apollo for grace, to Zeus for triumph, or to Nike, the winged goddess of victory, asking that her favour rest lightly upon their shoulders. The offerings were simple but symbolic. Small cakes of barley, splashes of oil, or sprigs of laurel. No athlete dared enter the field without honouring the divine order that governed both fate and fortune. To compete without prayer was unthinkable, almost blasphemous. It meant arrogance, the worst sin in the Greek world. Even champions knew their victories were borrowed, gifts lent by the gods that could be snatched away without warning. Many athletes made vows before the games. If they won, they would dedicate their olive crown to Zeus, or donate their prize money to the local temple. When the prayers ended, the tension broke. The crowd erupted in cheers, flutes began to play, and the competitors stepped onto the sand, their bodies gleaming, their spirits calm. The Greeks believed that prayer aligned the human heart with the divine rhythm of the cosmos. In that still moment between supplication and competition, mortal and god stood side by side. The contest that followed was not mere sport. It was worship made visible. When the prayers ended, training began, not as chaos but as a carefully choreographed ritual. The gymnasium was a symphony of motion. In one corner, wrestlers locked arms in clouds of dust, their muscles straining under the morning light. In another, runners sprinted along the xystos, their feet striking the packed earth with rhythmic precision. The sounds of exertion, grunts, shouts, and the crack of javelins echoed beneath marble colonnades. Training in Greece was as much philosophy as it was physical mastery. Each discipline represented a virtue. Wrestling taught endurance and cunning. Running built perseverance. The discus demanded grace. The javelin required precision. To train the body was to discipline the soul. No man can be free, said the philosopher Epictetus, who is not master of himself. The gymnasium was where that mastery began. The Paido tribes, the trainer, watched closely. His voice carried across the yard, instructing, correcting, commanding. He was part teacher, part priest, part sculptor, shaping human clay into ideals of perfection. Beside him stood the elliptes, the oiler, who rubbed down tired limbs, massaged cramped muscles, and anointed bruises with warm oil and herbs. The process was intimate, rhythmic, and revered. Every movement was intentional. The Greeks did not train for chaos, they trained for harmony. Before throwing a discus, an athlete would pause, breathe, and visualize its flight. Before wrestling, he studied his opponent's stance, not to dominate him brutally, but to outthink him. Mind and body acted as one. The goal was not simply victory, but sophrosyne, balance, restraint, self-awareness. Spectators sometimes gathered along the peristyle to watch. They came not for entertainment, but for inspiration. To see a man move with perfect rhythm and control was to glimpse divine order in human form. Plato himself once said that watching a trained body was like reading philosophy in motion. By midday, the courtyard shimmered with heat, and the athletes' bodies glistened with oil and dust. The training ended as it began, in ritual calm. They stood together in silence, breathing deeply, their hearts steady. The gymnasium was not only a place to prepare for competition, it was a living altar where Greece worshipped the body as the bridge between Earth and Olympus. The gymnasium was more than a place of training. It was a brotherhood. Within its marble walls, men of every background came together, farmers, soldiers, poets, and aristocrats. Here, rank meant nothing. Every man stripped bare, united by sweat, discipline, and shared devotion to the gods. The equality of the gymnasium was sacred, a reminder that before the gods, all mortals were the same. Conversations flowed freely between exercises. Young men debated philosophy as they rested beneath the porticos. "What is virtue?" one might ask, while rubbing the dust from his shoulders. Another would quote a line from Homer, or challenge a companion to a race to settle the matter. Socrates himself was said to have frequented gymnasia, arguing ideas of courage and love among the athletes. The Greek gymnasium, in this way, became both a school and a sanctuary, a place where the mind trained as rigorously as the body. Older men served as mentors, teaching not only techniques but ideals, humility in victory, dignity in defeat, and respect for the opponent. Younger athletes were taught to compete not for personal glory alone, but for the honour of their polis. Rivalries were fierce, but respect was absolute. Even enemies could clasp hands after a match, bound by the shared understanding that both had served something higher. After training, men bathed together in the lutron, a ritual of cleansing that erased the dirt of competition and restored equality. The oil and sand that once marked exertion were washed away, leaving the water cloudy, but the spirit renewed. It was said that these baths were where true friendships, and sometimes political alliances, were born. Yet, this brotherhood wasn't purely physical. It carried moral weight. To betray your comrades in the gymnasium was to betray your city. To train without integrity was to insult the gods. The gymnasium shaped not just athletes, but citizens, men whose strength served community before self. In the rhythm of shared training, the Greeks found something eternal: unity through excellence. To sweat beside another man was to understand him. To compete honourably was to love him as a brother. And in that brotherhood, the Greeks believed, the divine could dwell among mortals. All the discipline of the gymnasium led to one purpose: the sacred games. For the Greeks, competition was not simply sport, it was ritual worship. Each major festival, from the Olympic to the Pythian, was held in honour of a god. The gymnasium served as the forge where athletes were refined for this divine theatre. When the time came, the competitors left the training yards and journeyed to Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, or Isthmia, places where mortals met the gaze of immortals. Before the games began, the athletes swore an oath at the altar of Zeus, promising to play fair, to cheat neither man nor god. Sacrifices were offered: oxen, doves, libations of wine, and the smoke rose into the summer air, carrying prayers to the heavens. Then, the contestants entered the stadium barefoot and glistening, their bodies gleaming with the same olive oil that had sanctified their training. The spectators filled the stands, chanting city names, waving branches of laurel and olive. The games were more than entertainment. They were living proof that excellence was divine. The Greeks believed that when a man pushed his body to its limits in honest struggle, the gods watched with delight. To win was not just fortune, it was a sign of divine favour. Every event had its own rhythm of ritual. Runners stood at the starting line, touching the earth before rising to salute Zeus. Wrestlers poured oil on their arms, then dust, each movement deliberate, almost prayer-like. Javelin throwers traced the flight of their weapon in the air before releasing it, whispering Hermes' name. Even the noise of the crowd carried a sacred energy, a collective hymn to human glory. Victory was rewarded not with gold, but with a simple wreath of wild olive or laurel, a crown more powerful than any jewel. The winner's name was carved into stone, sung by poets, and painted on vases. He would return home as a hero, paraded through his city, sometimes fed for life at public expense. But the Greeks never saw these contests as mortal vanity. They were offerings, gifts of muscle, sweat, and endurance to the gods who had given man his strength. In the sand and the sunlight, the line between athlete and deity blurred. When the contests ended and the shouting of the crowd faded into memory, the rituals of the gymnasium were not over. Victory or defeat mattered less than purification, for both were gifts from the gods. Every athlete, bruised and coated in dust, returned to the lutron, the bathhouse adjoining the training grounds. It was here that the physical and spiritual cleansing began. The attendants prepared basins of cool water mixed with herbs and oils. Bronze strigils glinted in the lamplight, ready to scrape away the day's labour. The athletes stood silently as the elliptes, the oiler, poured water over their shoulders. The first sound was always the same, the hiss of water meeting hot skin, followed by the rhythmic scrape of metal. Oil, sweat, and sand came away in grey ribbons, leaving the body bare again, renewed, almost reborn. But this cleansing was more than hygiene. It was a symbolic act, a shedding of mortal toil. The Greeks believed that competition, though sacred, stirred powerful passions, pride, envy, wrath. To cleanse the body was to restore harmony to the soul. Even the victors submitted humbly to the ritual, for arrogance before the gods was unforgivable. The loser, meanwhile, was comforted with equal reverence. Both had honoured Zeus with their effort, and the water erased all differences. Once clean, the athletes were anointed again with fresh olive oil, not for battle, but for peace. The scent of the oil mingled with incense rising from nearby altars. Priests offered thanks for the safe return of all competitors, while poets recited hymns celebrating the day's contests. The gymnasium, once roaring with exertion, now echoed softly with murmured prayers and splashing water. In the evenings, men gathered under the colonnades to eat, discuss philosophy, and reflect on the lessons of the day. For the Greeks, the cleansing after the contest completed the sacred cycle: struggle, purification, and reflection. It reminded them that strength without humility was meaningless. By nightfall, the courtyard glowed with torchlight, the air rich with oil and laurel smoke. The athletes' bodies, now clean and calm, seemed carved from marble once more. In their quiet stillness, the Greeks saw something divine, proof that through ritual and discipline even mortals could touch eternity.